Welcome to lesson 6 of BookSmart. And today, if you have your pullout map, we will be discussing towards the bottom half in the final class, the final lesson. Lesson 6, we're going to be discussing Kabbalah and Chassidus, or in English, Chasidism. We will get right into it without much introduction. First, we will do as we did the past 5 weeks. We will give an introduction on the history of what is Kabbalah, what is Chassidus, go through the history of its books as they were published, and then we will actually do some intense and in-depth Chassidus and Kabbalistic study. So that's going to be quite exciting, quite interesting, and quite deep. Different than the technical aspects of the prior weeks. It's going to be a deep discussion of these ideas. In the previous 5 lessons, we familiarized ourselves with 6 different areas or genres of Torah. We spoke about the written Torah, the Midrash, the Kabbalah, the Talmud, various Talmuds, the Jerusalemite Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Jewish law, halacha, Musar, ethics and character, and Chakira, Jewish philosophy. Today's lesson, we're going to be exploring the teachings of Kabbalah and Chassidus, both of which belong to the area known as the soul, the neshama of Torah. That's what we will be discussing today, Torah's inner spiritual dimension. And we're going to begin with Kabbalah because it is the older of the 2 disciplines. And as you can see in the map, the lighter green line from the darker turquoise line. It's the older from the 2, not older. Literally, all Torah comes from Moses and Mount Sinai, was transmitted by God to Moses, as we've discussed in the first lesson. What I mean by older was published earlier as individual volumes. And so we will first discuss Kabbalah, and then we will move on to Chassidus, which is both an extension of Kabbalah as well as a dimension of Torah in its own right, as we will see in the second half of today's lesson. What is Kabbalah? We hear that word. It's a word that's thrown around, especially here in Los Angeles, Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? The word Kabbalah literally means that which is received. That's what the Hebrew word Kabbalah means. Another name for the teachings of Kabbalah is Sod. It's a Hebrew word, sod. What does sod mean? Sod means a secret. These are the 2 names with which this dimension of Torah generally referred to, and that is because Kabbalah's teachings are received secrets. What does that mean? These are secrets of the Torah, the esoteric dimension of Torah that were transmitted through the generations from teacher to disciple, by a select number of individuals while being carefully concealed from everybody else. Let's have a look in text 1 on page 235, the way Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed explains this dimension of Torah. This is Maimonides. As you are well aware, even the Talmud, which was received by tradition, was not originally committed to writing in a book that was disseminated to the people. Now, if care was taken to avoid writing the oral Torah in a book accessible to all because of the disadvantages in such a system, certainly then no portion of the esoteric teachings of Torah could be written which would divulge these teachings to everyone. Rather, these teachings were orally communicated by a few uniquely qualified individuals to other uniquely qualified individuals, as I earlier explained the saying from the Talmud. The secrets of the Torah can only be entrusted to skilled sages. Nothing but a few remarks and allusions to these teachings are to be found in the Talmud and the Midrashim. They are like small kernels enveloped in many husks, so that the reader is generally occupied with the husk without thinking that it encloses a kernel. So in other words, what Maimonides is telling us here in text 1 is that the teachings of Kabbalah are doubly secret. Or I guess to use the term from Churchill, it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. That is what the teachings of Kabbalah is. They're doubly secret. What does that mean? First, they were only transmitted within a very select group of sages. So it wasn't for everyone. It was kept secret, quite literally. Secondly, the teachings themselves were conveyed in an esoteric terminology, employing hints, metaphors, and these hints and metaphors were only decipherable by those initiated into the study circle of this hidden wisdom. So these teachings of Kabbalah remained a secret even to those who read these texts and thought they understood them. They were still a secret. Which brings to mind the story of Boris, who for years fought to leave the Soviet Union, and he finally manages to get out of the Soviet Union. And as the customs in Moscow is going through his bags, they open his suitcase and they see this bust of Lenin. And they ask him, what are you doing with this bust of Lenin? He says, oh, Lenin, I mean, that's Lenin. They ask him, what is this? He said, what do you mean, what is this? Who is this? This is Lenin. Lenin is the man that has such wonderful ideas and gave us purpose what to live for. And of course, wherever I go, I travel with a bust of his. So they zip up his suitcase and they let him go. He arrives in the United States, and the American custom official, they're going through this, and they find the bust, and they say, so tell us, what is this? He says, what is this? That's a bust of Lenin. Lenin's such a terrible person who caused millions of people to do such terrible things and to be cause hardship and suffering to many, many millions of people. I'm going to be taking this bust of his and placing it in my bathroom right next to the toilet in a way of humiliating him. All right, the American official is a little surprised. He takes it, puts it back in, and seals it, and he comes, and he lets the guy through. The guy goes through, and he arrives at his family's house in Brooklyn, where he had children and grandchildren living there, and they see their grandfather arrived from Russia after many years of not seeing him. And he opens his suitcase, and they see this bust there, and his little grandson comes over and says, Grandpa, what is that? Who is that? The grandpa says, who is it? It's not who, it's what? It's 8 pounds of gold. So when you look at something, right, don't judge a book by its cover. When you look at something, you don't necessarily know what it is. So even the Kabbalistic teachings that people did manage to hear, they didn't necessarily understand it because they were using a special code and hints and allusions that weren't decipherable to everybody. Why is there a need for this secrecy? So as we see here in Los Angeles, and as we can readily understand, it's important to note that Kabbalah is the most misunderstood and misrepresented part of Torah. In fact, according to the Talmud, studying Kabbalah without the proper preparation and guidance can even be dangerous, literally. Let's have a look in text 2, perhaps one of the more famous texts about Kabbalah, which gives us an idea on how careful we have to be when studying Kabbalah. Page 236, text 2. Quote from the Talmud, a fascinating story. The Talmud tells us as follows: 4 sages entered the orchard. The names of these 4 sages were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Right? Perhaps from these 4, the most famous is Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Zoma looked and went mad. Acher cut down the plantings, i.e. became a heretic. Rabbi Akiva entered in wholeness and peace and emerged in wholeness and peace. What's this story from the Talmud? What does it mean? What's it telling us? Let's start from the beginning of the passage. It says 4 sages entered the orchard. What's the orchard? The orchard, the Hebrew word for orchard is paradis. Think paradise. It's actually, etymologically, that's where the word paradise comes from. What's paradise? What do we imagine? Paradise, right? Different people have different imaginations, but we know what paradise means. Paradise means something magnificent, something beyond our wildest imagination, something, a place which is beyond our, right? That place where we want to take our vacation. That's paradise. Literally, paradise means an orchard. What type of orchard is it referencing here? Four sages entered the orchard. What orchard is it talking about? It's referencing the esoteric secrets of the Torah. This is a hidden garden of spiritual delights, because there's no greater pleasure for the soul than the spiritual bliss of understanding the deepest wisdom contained in the Torah. So the Talmud tells us that four sages entered the orchard. In other words, four sages attempted to study the esoteric dimension of Torah, the Kabbalistic secrets of the Torah. And of the four, only Rabbi Akiva emerged b'shalom, only Rabbi Akiva emerged in wholeness and peace. The other three were also great sages. They were colleagues of the great Rabbi Akiva. Nonetheless, they were severely damaged by the experience. Ben Azai was so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the truths that he beheld that his soul could no longer bear its containment within a physical body, and it broke free from it. He literally died from ecstasy. Ben Zoma, second sage, he went mad. Literally, he went crazy because his mind could not assimilate what he saw. The third sage, Elisha ben Avuya, the great sage Elisha ben Avuya, who is here referenced by his euphemism, Acher, he saw things that he could not possibly grasp, and therefore he lost his faith, and he became a heretic. The only one to emerge wholly and with peace, in peace, was Rabbi Akiva. Why? And it's a key point. If we look back at the text, on text 2, because he entered in wholeness and peace. And so he left in wholeness and peace. What does it mean he entered in wholeness and peace? He entered the orchard. He began studying Kabbalah with the proper knowledge, proper training, the proper guidance, the proper approach. And that's why it was a positive and productive experience for him. And so if entering the orchard was such a perilous undertaking for these great sages, imagine the risks involved for ordinary individuals. Because the more powerful something is, the more dangerous it is. And there's nothing more powerful than ideas. You see, a very practical analogy for this is nuclear power. Nuclear power is by far the most efficient, the most sustainable, the cleanest energy source available to us. A relatively small amount of nuclear reactors could supply all our energy needs using a tiny quantity of fuel with minimal impact on the environment. So why don't we use it? Why isn't the only one? Because there's one small problem. One tiny deviation from the way it's supposed to be run can cause enormous catastrophes. Super dangerous. The more powerful something is, it's great, it's wonderful, it's efficient, it's clean, it's everything. But one tiny deviation from the way it's supposed to be can cause immense destruction. It's immensely productive when it's done properly. The slightest deviation from protocol and safety guidelines is utter catastrophe. And the same is with the power and the ideas of Kabbalah. All ideas in the world are the most powerful thing, more powerful than money, more powerful than fame, more powerful. What's the most powerful thing? Ideas, freedom, justice, morality, democracy. And then there's the other ones, fascism, communism. These are all ideas. And these ideas have had more power throughout history than the greatest armies and the strongest tanks, warplanes, and so on. Because ideas have power and have the most power. And so, especially when we're talking about ideas that come from Torah, the most powerful ideas are found in the secret parts of Torah. See, because generally speaking, the ideas contained within the Torah have shaped the world we live in today. The most powerful of these ideas are those contained in the Torah's innermost secret dimension, in this sod, in this hidden element. The ideas in Kabbalah deal with the most fundamental truths of our existence. Why do we exist? Why did God create the world? What is God? All of these questions, what is the soul? What is the purpose of a mitzvah? What is our mission in life? These are all very, very powerful ideas, and they are all expounded upon within Kabbalah. These are all powerful ideas, and they contain many, many nuances and paradoxes, which means that they can also be misunderstood and distorted in ways that are very damaging and destructive. And we'll see later on in the class, when we discuss actual Kabbalistic ideas, we'll see an example of how powerful and empowering an idea can be, but also how it can be misunderstood and become a very dangerous and damaging idea. So the history of Kabbalah is the story of the tension between these two very powerful needs: the need to conceal and the need to transmit and reveal. Because on the one hand, the Kabbalists were very much aware of the need to conceal Kabbalah's esoteric wisdom, because it may be distorted and corrupted. On the other hand, they were also driven by the need to pass on these powerful truths for the great power that they possess to elevate our lives. And it took many centuries for this tension to reach its resolution in the teachings of Chasidism, as we will see. So before we get to studying actual Kabbalah, we'll have a brief clip that will give us an insight into the history of Kabbalah, its primary teachers, the primary works, and the schools of Kabbalah throughout the centuries. So bear with me as I pull it up. There we go.
The Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, formed an integral part of the Torah's transmission from its very beginnings. The earliest Kabbalistic works are attributed to Abraham, the first Jew, or even earlier to Adam, the first man. The Talmud and the Midrashim incorporate many Kabbalistic passages. These teachings, however, were the exclusive province of a small number of sages who engaged in the study of this esoteric wisdom, and even fewer who dared to disseminate it. The prophet Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot, Merkava, recorded in the book of Ezekiel, is the biblical source for many Kabbalistic principles and ideas. A number of early Kabbalistic texts were composed in Mishnaic times, in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. These texts, however, are extremely terse and mysterious, their meaning decipherable only to those who were privy to the oral tradition that accompanied them. The great Mishnaic sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught the wisdom of Kabbalah to a close circle of disciples. These discourses and discussions were recorded in the Zohar, which remains the most basic text of Kabbalah. The Zohar, however, would remain a secret text for more than 1,000 years, although snippets of it found their way into some of the Torah works composed in the interim. The first fissures in the veil of secrecy surrounding Kabbalah began to appear in the 12th century in Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, where small groups of Kabbalists and their disciples were expounding and transcribing their teachings. It was during this period that the Zohar was first published, making its hitherto hidden teachings available to those who were admitted into the secretive Kabbalistic circles. The Chassidim of Ashkenaz was a school of Jewish mystics who were active in the German Rhineland in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its leaders, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid and Rabbi Elazar Rokeach of Worms. One of the preeminent sages of Spanish Jewry, Nachmanides, authored important works in all areas of Torah, biblical commentary, Talmudic analysis, Torah law, philosophy, and ethics. Nachmanides was also a master Kabbalist who incorporated many Kabbalistic ideas into his commentary on the Torah. Rabbi Abraham Abulafia and his disciples, active in 13th century Italy, emphasized the practice of meditative Kabbalah and the attainment of mystical union with God. Other noted Kabbalists of the medieval period include the anonymous author of the foundational Kabbalistic work Ma'arechet HaElokut and Rabbi Yosef Gikatila, Rabbi Menachem Merkanti, Rabbi Meir ibn Gabbai, and Rabbi Yehuda Chayat. Despite the surge in dissemination by the medieval Kabbalists, Kabbalah was still a secret discipline, studied and taught by an exclusive circle of mystics. The next breakthrough came in the mid-16th century, when Tzfat, a city in the north of the Holy Land, became a center of Jewish mystical learning. One of the early teachers of Kabbalah in Tzfat was Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, who is known as the author of the mystical poem Lecha Dodi, Come My Beloved to Meet the Bride, sung in Jewish communities on Friday evening to welcome the Shabbat. Rabbi Yosef Karo, known primarily as the author of the Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law, was also an accomplished Kabbalist, who recorded his mystical visions in his Magid Mesharim. At the hub of the Tzfat mystics were two great teachers of Kabbalah, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, known as Ramak, and Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, known by the acronym Ari, the Lion. Ramak's encyclopedic Pardes Ramonim, Orchard of Pomegranates, was a first-of-its-kind, systematic explanation of the multitude of worlds, virot, and concepts that populate Kabbalistic teaching. Ari, although his sojourn in Tzfat was cut short after only 2 years when he died in a plague at the age of 38, left behind numerous disciples and a vast body of teachings. Indeed, almost all subsequent Jewish mystical learning is predicated on the Ari's teaching. Ari revolutionized the realm of Jewish mystical learning by proclaiming that the restrictions on disseminating Kabbalistic teachings applied only in earlier generations, and that in these times it is permitted and obligatory to reveal this wisdom. As a result, a number of Ari's disciples labored to record and publicize his teachings and to seed centers of Kabbalistic learning throughout the Jewish world. One of these disciples, Rabbi Israel Sarug, traveled for 20 years throughout Italy, the Balkans, Germany, Poland, Turkey, Egypt, and elsewhere to introduce the Lurianic Kabbalah. From Tzfat, the teachings of Kabbalah spread across the Jewish world. In the following generations, additional masters and schools of Kabbalistic learning developed in various Jewish communities. Maharal was a mystic and philosopher who expressed Kabbalistic ideas in philosophical terms. His teachings influenced many subsequent schools of Jewish thought. Maharal's Kabbalah appears to derive from earlier sources, as the Tzfatian Kabbalah had not yet reached Eastern Europe in his day. There is a tradition that Maharal used Kabbalistic formulae to create a golem, a humanoid, to save the Jewish community of Prague from the frequent blood libels of the time. Another influential figure in Jewish philosophy and mysticism was Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, who served as a rabbi in numerous Jewish communities in both Europe and the Holy Land, including Dubna, Frankfurt, Prague, Jerusalem, Tzfat, and Tiberias. He's known as Shalah, after his magnum opus, Shnei Luchot HaBrit, 2 Tablets of the Covenant, which blends Kabbalah, Talmudic discourse, Torah law and customs, biblical commentary, and ethics. Shalah's works incorporate the teachings of Ramak and Ari and their disciples. Other 16th and 17th century Kabbalists include Rabbi Yisrael Najar of Gaza, Rabbi Menachem Azaria di Fano of Italy, and Rabbi Naftali Hertz Bachrach of Germany. Prominent 18th century Kabbalists include Ramchal, a prodigious author of Kabbalah, philosophy, ethics, and poetry, and Rabbi Chaim ibn Attar. The Gra school of Kabbalah encompasses the Kabbalistic teachings of Rabbi Eliyahu, the Gaon of Vilna, and his disciples. In Jerusalem, the Bet El School of Kabbalah was a center of mystical learning for 250 years. Its leaders included Rabbi Shalom Sharabi of Yemen and Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, the Chidah. Notwithstanding all of this activity and publications, Kabbalah remained a closed book for the great majority of Jews. The teachings remained esoteric, requiring a subtle mind and extensive knowledge and training to properly understand. As a rule, the restrictions placed on the study of Kabbalah were still widely enforced. For example, a person had to be past the age of 40 and had to be thoroughly versed in the revealed portions of the Torah, such as Talmud and Halacha, before they would be permitted to approach its hidden element. The final breakthrough, which paved the way for the realization of the Ari's declaration conviction that the time had come for the inner soul of Torah to be revealed came with the founding of the Hasidic movement by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov in 1734. In addition to revealing an entirely new dimension of Torah, Chasidism also popularized and made accessible the teachings of Kabbalah by explaining its ideas in ways that made them comprehensible and applicable to all.
All right. So with that overview of Kabbalah, and the history of Kabbalah, we'll now move on. Well, we're not moving on from Kabbalah, but we're just moving on a little bit to the background of Chasidism. What is Chasidism? As we just mentioned in the video, the Hasidic movement was founded by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, known generally as the Baal Shem Tov, in the year 1734. Over the next 2 generations, it spread throughout the Jewish world, energizing and revitalizing the Jewish world. It spread like wildfire. And Chasidism derives its core ideas from the Zohar, the teachings of the Ari, and those of later mystics such as the Maharal, the Shalah. Chasidism stresses the mystical dimension of the Torah and various other ideas. Joyfulness in serving God, love of every Jew, regardless of their material standing or spiritual standing, intellectual and emotional engagement in prayer, finding godliness in every aspect of one's existence, the elevation of the material universe, the role of a tzaddik, the righteous leader in guiding a person's relationship with the Almighty. As we mentioned at the beginning of today's class, what is Chasidism? Chasidism is both an extension of Kabbalah as well as a field of Torah in its own right. So first, let's discuss the role of Chasidism or Chassidus as a vehicle for explaining and disseminating the teachings of Kabbalah. As we saw in the video, there was an incremental process that unfolded over the generations in which the secrets of Kabbalah were gradually brought into the open. From the near absolute secrecy at the time of the Talmud to the increased activity in the Middle Ages and up until the revelation of Hasidic teachings, of Kabbalistic teachings through Chassidus by the Baal Shem Tovs and his disciples throughout the last 3 centuries. The obvious question that one asks is, what changed? What changed? If these esoteric teachings are ones that should remain esoteric and they need to be kept secret because of the danger of misinterpretation, then why was it subsequently allowed, and not just allowed, but even encouraged that they should be revealed? And if we need the spiritual empowerment that these teachings provide, then why were they hidden from earlier generations? So the first point is, Chasidism didn't just disseminate the teachings of Kabbalah. It also explains these teachings of Kabbalah in ways that are comprehensible to everyone, not only to the subtle and trained mind of a mystic. Right? It's a difference between, say when it comes to teaching theoretical physics. So if you're to explain theoretical physics by way of mathematical formulas, then you got to be an advanced mathematician to understand theoretical physics. But explaining theoretical physics in lay people's languages with proper examples and metaphors and analogies, anyone can understand it. So when it comes to Kabbalah as well, Kabbalah employs a very specialized language and a system of metaphors, which unless the student knows how to tear off this outer layer and break down the terminology and these metaphors, it's very hard to understand these ideas, and they can easily be misinterpreted, misrepresented, and distorted. What Hasidic teaching does is it presents these ideas using analogies and explanations that are relatable to everyone. So it carries the full power of Kabbalah, but without the danger of their being distorted and misapplied. But the question still is, right? Granted, Chassidus now, we understand, does not have that danger of being misinterpreted and misrepresented and distorted, so that danger is no longer there. But if Chassidus is so important, and if Kabbalah is so important, why? What's unique about now? Why in the past 200-300 years was it suddenly revealed, the Hasidic dimension of Torah? This form of teaching Kabbalah, why was it only revealed in the recent generations? Why were the earlier sages, who were certainly no less righteous and no less wise, not able to present the soul of Torah in this fashion? Why did it have to be now, in the past 3 centuries? On the most basic level, the answer to this question is the same that we would answer regarding all areas of the oral Torah, as we explained in the prior lessons. Why were certain halachic issues raised and resolved many generations after the Torah was given upon Mount Sinai? Why were certain midrashic teachings only expounded upon when they were? Why were certain philosophical questions first analyzed by Maimonides thousands of years after the Torah was given, and certain ethical principles were first discussed in Ibn Bakuda's Duties of the Hearts thousands of years after the Torah was given at Mount Sinai? And the answer, of course, is that the nature of the Torah is the divine human partnership embodied within it, as we explained in the first lesson, in which each generation realizes a further stage in the communication of the divine wisdom and how to implement it in our lives, in our generation. Right? And we read about this process in the great mystic and sage, the Shalah, the great 16th century sage, how he explains this idea, how it does all come from Sinai, but there's the process. Let's read it again in text 3 on page 243. In the blessing recited before studying Torah, we say, "Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah." In truth, God has already given us the Torah at Mount Sinai, yet he still gives the Torah perpetually. This matter requires some elaboration. The Torah says, "These words God spoke to your entire assembly at the mountain, a great voice that did not cease." Right? That's what the verse says regarding the voice of God at Mount Sinai. Rashi explains the meaning of the words "did not cease" in accordance with the translation by Onkelos. It did not stop. You see, in the Hebrew, "did not cease" and "did not stop" can have the same words. So you can say that the voice of God did not cease, or, in other words, did not stop. And why did it not stop? Because it is a powerful voice that endures forever. Rashi also offers a second interpretation of the words "velo yasaf." It did not anymore. In other words, that God did not again speak so openly and publicly as he did at Sinai. So in other words, it's paradoxical to a degree, because on the one hand, it did not cease. In other words, it didn't stop, or it did not anymore. In other words, it stopped immediately. So which one is it? Did it not stop, or did it stop? Explains the Shalah, and here's the key point. There is a profound significance in these two interpretations, as they are simultaneously true. The divine voice spoke the Torah at Sinai and did not anymore, as all the subsequent laws and edicts instituted by the sages throughout the generations were not explicitly commanded by God at the time. So it did not anymore. At the same time, it did not cease, for everything was included in potential form within that voice. It is only that for everything there was a time and season, and the time had not yet come for that potential to emerge into actuality, as that depends on the initiative of those down here below in accordance with their nature, their abilities, and in accordance with the qualities of the souls of each generation. The sages of each generation were then roused to actualize from that potential in accordance with the time and season. Thus, the sages did not invent anything from their own minds, God forbid, but rather actualized the divine intent. So generally speaking, why now? Because that's when it was ready to be revealed. That's when this generation's mind, soul aligned to in the divine human partnership in revealing the Torah. This is the generation that realizes this further stage in the communication of the divine wisdom and how to implement it in our lives. But there is a more time-specific reason why the teachings of Chassidus, Kabbalah and Chassidus were revealed in the recent generations. And the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chasidism, tells us why that is. He writes as follows in a letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law. And he writes a fascinating anecdote, a story. This is text 4 on page 245. On Rosh Hashanah of the year 5507, 1746, my soul ascended to the higher worlds. I rose level after level until I reached the chamber of Mashiach. I asked Mashiach, when will the master come? When are you coming? He answered, by this you will know when your teachings will become known and revealed throughout the world and your wellsprings will be spread to the outside. Mashiach told the Baal Shem Tov, when will Mashiach come? When the teachings of Chasidism will be disseminated throughout the entire world. What's the connection between Hasidic teachings and Mashiach? See, the coming of Mashiach represents the ultimate realization of what Judaism aims to accomplish. It is the end goal of the whole of Jewish history, Jewish learning, Jewish practice. Every mitzvah we perform, every prayer we utter, every effort we make to live a life of awareness of purpose is oriented toward creating the future world promised by all the prophets, a world that is free of hunger, war, of strife, of suffering, of evil and corruption, a perfect world, a world of peace, the world of the redemption by Moshiach. The engine that drives, the driving force behind the development of our world towards this state of perfection is learning and knowledge. On the physical material level, we've seen as the generations go on, we see how increased human knowledge has done tremendous. It's cured diseases, extended human lifespan, increased food production, and many other examples we can all think of. By the same token, the key to solving the world's spiritual ills lies in the increase of spiritual knowledge and the potent truths that are contained within the esoteric soul of Torah. Until we reach the era of Mashiach, the age of Mashiach, of which the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah says that when Mashiach comes, the world is filled with the knowledge of God as water covers the sea. And this is why the well springs of the inner soul of Torah become increasingly more accessible as the world advances toward the divine goodness and perfection of the Messianic age. As we explain this concept in length at the course a couple of years back, this is possible, I think it was, or I don't recall the exact name of the course. Either way, it was a course entirely about Mashiach and the connection of the study of Torah and the coming of Mashiach. And that is why Chassidus has become more accessible and more revealed as the ages and as the years go on, because we are getting closer to the era of Mashiach. Also, similar to the idea of like we spoke last week about Jewish philosophy, the idea of Chassidus are connected with, as we get closer to the era of Mashiach, the more potent the forces of the other side are, the forces of the world around us, which isn't conducive to Judaism, to the study of Torah, it's becoming a lot easier to do things that are not in line with the values and morals as they are understood in the Torah values and morals. We need to bring out, so to speak, the big guns. We need to bring out the deeper areas of Torah to counter those in order to have more spiritual ammunition, if you will, to keep ourselves more spiritually ahead and stronger in order to enable us to come out on top. That's the first dimension of Chassidus. The second dimension of Chassidus is the inner soul of all genres of Torah. See, Chassidus is not just a better and a safer way of explaining Kabbalah. Chassidus has something in and of itself. It's the inner soul of all areas and genres of Torah. It reveals the inner spiritual dimension of the written Torah, of the teachings of the Midrash and the Talmud, of the Halacha, of the Torah philosophy, of Torah ethics. And in doing so, it shows how all these areas of Torah are interconnected. Excuse me. Chassidus reveals the inner thread that connects everything. It shows how all areas of Torah are really interconnected. They're all expressions of the same essence. And so that's what we will do now. We will now study some examples of Hasidic teaching, of Kabbalistic teaching through the lens of Chassidus. And we will see how Chassidus makes accessible the mysterious ideas of Kabbalah. And we will also see how Chassidus reveals the inner essence of other genres of Torah. All right. So up until this point, we've had an introduction to Kabbalah and Chassidus, a brief overview and history of Kabbalah and Chassidus. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes to understand what is Kabbalah, to study a little bit of Kabbalah. Now, bear with me. It can get a little bit intense. It can get a little bit confusing, but it'll all tie up together in the end. So begin by reading a mysterious text from the most fundamental work of Kabbalah, the Zohar. That's where we're going to begin the study of Kabbalah. So here it goes. Text 5, page 248. This is a direct quote from the most fundamental work of Kabbalah, the Zohar, page 248. At the beginning of the manifestation of the king's will, the lamp of darkness engraved engravings in the supernal purity. It emanated from the most concealed of all concealed things, from the secret of endlessness. A formless vapor was inserted into a circle that was neither white nor black, nor red nor green, nor any color at all. When he began its measurements, he created bright colors to shine forth. From within the center of the lamp, a fountain spouted, from which the colors down below were painted. End quote of the Zohar. By raise of hands, who understood this text? Or by raise of hands, who didn't understand this text? Post it in the chat box. Understood or didn't understand? Who's going to be brave? I'll be the first one to announce. I have no clue what we just read. Right in the face of it, I mean, it's gibberish. It seems to be a nice poem. Definitely means something. Seems profound. I have no idea what it's talking about. Now, it would be nice if I could tell you that at the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to reread this text and understand it fully. But that's not the case with any Torah text. and much less with the text from the esoteric teachings of Kabbalah. What we will do is spend the better part of the next 40 minutes or so studying the ideas alluded to in this mysterious text, and at the end of today's lesson, we'll have scratched the surface of these mysterious lines, it would have been a successful class. So let's jump right in. In order to decipher this mysterious text, we'll start from the Talmud. And we'll see, as we mentioned earlier in the beginning, from the quote of Maimonides in the Guide of the Perplexed, we'll see one of the hidden kernels of the esoteric wisdom contained within the Talmud that's within the Talmud, but it's really a Kabbalistic teaching that doesn't seem so on the surface. Here's the quote from the Talmud, text 6, page 250. And this is a fascinating, profound idea. God fills the world like the soul fills the body. Right? It's a nice one-liner, nice inspirational quote. This idea is a very powerful and empowering idea on many levels. First of all, what does it mean? First of all, this statement means that just like our own soul, which is the vital force within us, animates every nook and cranny of our body, from the brain to the toenail to the finger, you name it, it's animated by our own soul. So is God intimately engaged with every one of his creations, from the greatest to the smallest, from the most spiritual to the most mundane, and is involved in every aspect of our existence. That's the first thing we take from this Talmudic statement. It's associating one with another. It's comparing the two. Secondly, it means that just like the soul expresses itself via the body, the soul thinks with the body's brain, the soul feels through the heart, the soul speaks through the vocal cords of the body, the soul creates through the body's hands, so does God express himself through the world that he created. Now, these are just two examples of the association between the body and the world, God and the soul. As the verse in Job says, from my own flesh I perceive God. So the teachings of Kabbalah and Chasidism expound on many more aspects of the Talmud's analogy, explaining how by contemplating on our own nature, we can comprehend, we can learn so much about God's relationship with our existence. The problem is, as we mentioned earlier, as powerful and as empowering this analogy is, it is also a very dangerous idea. So this is an example of a Kabbalistic idea that if it isn't done with the proper guidance, with the proper understanding, with proper preparation, it can lead a person down a very, very dangerous rabbit. Why? Why is this a dangerous idea? Because the Torah warns in the strongest possible terms, and as we expounded upon it in the prior course, my God, the Torah warns against the dangers of attributing any physical properties, or for that matter, any properties at all, to God. All right, the verse tells us clearly, do not attribute any physical qualities to God. Right, text 7, straight from Deuteronomy, page 251. Guard your souls exceedingly, as you have not seen any form on the day that God spoke to you at Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, from within the fire. Lest you be corrupted and make for yourselves a graven image, the form of any symbol, and be led astray to bow to it and worship it. According to Maimonides, this warning is one of the 13 fundamental principles of the Jewish faith. As we see here in text 8, and many communities actually say this in their daily prayers. This is the third principle, says Maimonides. The third principle is the negation of any physical qualities in regard to God. Meaning, we believe that the one God is neither a physical entity nor a physical force, nor is he subject to any physical state. The most cardinal principle in Judaism is the statement expressed in the Shema that Hashem Echad, God is one. What does God is one mean? God is one doesn't only mean that there is only one God, not 2 or 3 or 20 or 40 or 50 gods. It means, as Maimonides explains at length, that God is the absolute singularity. Every existence that we know, from our own self to a simple molecule, every existence or phenomenon that we can imagine in our minds is a composite existence, an existence that is composed of various parts and qualities. I have a mind, a heart, arms, a leg, multiplicity of traits and characteristics. A simple stone possesses multiplicity of properties. It has a specific size, mass, shape, texture. God is one means that we cannot attribute any properties to God. We cannot quantify, qualify, or describe God in any way, shape, or form. In the words of the prophet, text 9, says the Holy One, to what can you liken me that I would be compared? You can't compare God to anything. So crucial is this truth to the integrity of Judaism that throughout our history, thousands upon thousands, countless of thousands of Jews have given up their very lives rather than betray this truth by accepting any idolatrous belief, even in word alone. This is why they ended their lives with this word, these words, Hashem Echad, God is one, on their lips. Now, why is this truth so important? Why is paganism, which is the attribution of particular qualities to God, such a terrible sin? Aren't there worse sins? I mean, murder is a terrible sin. I can think of so many worse sins. Why does it seem like this is the single worst sin out there? And the answer is, paganism might seem like a rather benign transgression, little more than a philosophical error, but in reality, it is the source of all evil. Because the minute I begin defining God, what does that mean? If I define God, I'm creating a made-to-order God based on my own ideas and inclinations. Once that happens, the entire basis for an absolute morality comes to an end. If God is what I think him to be, then ultimately God wants what I want him to want. God decrees what I would like him to decree. And that's a really slippery slope, because then I will justify anything that I want to do, consciously or unconsciously, by deciding that that's what God wants me to do. And so we cannot attribute any quality, any property whatsoever to God. On the other hand, we have another truth that is no less fundamental to Judaism, and that is the belief that we have a personal relationship with God. We believe that God is deeply invested in the world he created, that God concerns himself with and is directly engaged in everything that transpires in the world, like we explained last week. Finally, we believe that our deeds have a real impact on God, that God experiences joy in our successes and sorrow in our failures. But if this is a fundamental belief, what does this imply? This implies seemingly an almost human God. It implies that God possesses human qualities like knowledge, understanding, desire, will, love, motivation, joy, anger, frustration, disappointment, sorrow. And the Torah seems to ascribe these qualities to God. Right? In text 10, from the verses, in Exodus and Chronicles, A compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness and truth. Unto you, God, is greatness and power and beauty and triumph and splendor. Unto you, God, is kingship. But hold on. Isn't this the same as projecting our own human qualities onto God? How do we reconcile this principle with the principle we just explained? The cardinal principle that we cannot attribute any corporeal qualities or even any qualities at all to God. So on the one hand, we're saying, can't attribute anything to God. On the other hand, we're saying, God feels our pain. God rejoices in our joy. God gets angry. God's compassionate, gracious. Make up your mind. Is God beyond us and we can't ascribe anything to God? And if we do, that's paganism and it's a rabbit hole, and it is. And on the other hand, we have the flip side that we ascribe these qualities. This seems like an irreconcilable paradox. And this really is the great paradox. Capital V, if you can say that. This is the great paradox that drives one of the central themes of Kabbalah. That we have two very fundamental truths, the truth of God's transcendence and the truth of God's immanence. And yet these two truths seem to contradict each other. How do we reconcile? How do we work? The basic answer to this great paradox is expressed by King David in Tehillim, in Psalms. What does King David say? Let's look in text 11. Would the one who implants the ear not hear? Would the one who forms the eye not see? God is the source of all that exists and everything that we can experience. Could God be lacking anything that his own works possess? God created intelligence, desire, love, anger, frustration, justice, creativity, and every other ability and quality that you can possibly conceive of, God created. Could the one who brought all of these into being be lacking any of them? Now, it's important to underline that in us, these qualities are definitions. They do empower us, but they also define and limit us. God is not and cannot be defined or limited by anything. So we must therefore conclude that God possesses these qualities without being defined by them. Or in other words, yes, we can't attribute any quality to God, but we can't disattribute any quality from God. So God obviously possesses all of these, but they don't define him. Because he can't not have them, but he can't be limited by them. The problem is that this explanation doesn't really explain the paradox. It only tells us the fact that, yes, the paradox exists. It tells us that God possesses all these qualities, but he's not qualified by them. But we still don't understand how it's possible. And like we explained in last week's class, that yes, we could accept it based on faith. Yeah, just have faith. It's God has it, right? With the one who implants the ear not hear. So God has ears, but on the other hand, he doesn't have ears, and you can't understand it. It's a paradox. All right, you can't understand it. Accept it. But faith isn't the be-all, end-all, because accepting is not the same as understanding. In order for God to be real to us, we need to reach a place where my knowledge of him is internalized in my heart, to paraphrase the verse. So therefore, Kabbalah comes and tries to understand this paradox and formulate a mental model by which it can be visualized. And this is where the model of the 10 Sephirot come in. And perhaps this idea is the most famous Kabbalistic teaching, and perhaps the most important Kabbalistic teaching, because it explains this paradox. And this is a theme that's super central to Kabbalah. Kabbalah references this idea time and again on perhaps every single page of Kabbalah. The 10 Sephirah is the model that Kabbalah uses to visualize the great paradox of God's involvement with our existence. Now, these Kabbalistic concepts take years and years and years to study. Every single Kabbalistic book is trying to understand the 10 spheres model, trying to understand various dimensions of it, trying to understand exactly how to apply it to various questions and how it, analyzing it and questioning it and breaking it down further and further. And at points, it may seem that not only doesn't it explain the great paradox, it actually strengthens the great paradox. And working through these esoteric ideas takes a lot of patience, right? Remember, as we saw in the video, that years ago, in early years and earlier generations, people have to wait till they were 40 to study Kabbalah. But I guess I shouldn't announce that, because I think over here I'm the only one under that age. But either way, the point is the same, which is people had to be well versed in the study of Torah and various disciplines in order before they even began scratching the surface of Kabbalah. So let's be patient as we go through this idea. What is this 10 Sefirot model? What are the 10 Sefirot? So let's get back to the beginning. And when I say the beginning, I mean literally the beginning, creation of the human being. A couple of lessons ago, we noted that despite the Torah's insistence that God has no form or image, the Torah itself seems to say that God does have a form and an image. As we explained at length from a halachic perspective, the following verses from Genesis, text 12. God said, let us make a human. Let us make a human being in our image, after our likeness. And God created the human in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, this is a very, very mysterious passage. And many, many questions. Many things that need to be analyzed and are analyzed and discussed from every single angle and facet possible, right? Common examples that we come up with: who's the us whom God is referring to? Are they angels? Are they future souls? Or is God just using the royal we, us? In other words, God's referring to just himself, but it's us. Also, how do we explain the abrupt transition? Did God create one person, or did God create them? He created him, male and female, he created them. Did God create one human or two? And there are many, 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 many other questions. But perhaps the greatest mystery in this passage concerns the divine image and likeness in which the human being was created. How do we reconcile this idea with the warnings that we mentioned earlier from the book of Deuteronomy, from Isaiah, from Maimonides, about not ascribing any image or form to God? The Torah itself seems to be saying that God has an image and a form, and that it's in that image and form that God created the human. So what's going on here? So Kabbalah explains as follows. Before we get to the creation of the human, what is creation in the first instance? And Kabbalah explains that there are two types of creation. There's external creation and internal creation. See, when I take a piece of wood and create a table out of it, when I have an idea and I put it down on paper and write a novel, I'm creating something outside of myself. On the other hand, there's internal creation, which is creating something within myself. When I think of the characters of the novel, when I formulate the characters of the novel in my mind, I'm creating something, but I'm creating something which is within my mind. It's not outside of it. That's internal creation, in the words of Kabbalah. In truth, says Kabbalah, every single act of creation, even external creation, has a process of internal creation. Because before I create that table, I have an internal creation step where I formulate the vision of what I want that table to look like. I create the image of that table in my mind. Before I write the novel, I create the image of the characters, the storyline, the ideas, the places in my mind before I put pen to paper. Their personalities, their emotions, their experiences are all in my imagination. I first need an internal creation, and only then can I proceed to create an external creation. According to Kabbalah, the same is true of God's creation of the world. The external creation that we see, the world around us, is only the final link in a chain of worlds, the highest of which is a holy internal creation that God created within himself. And here's a very subtle idea. When I created that table, I first needed to create within my mind the idea of the table, the purpose it will serve as a kitchen table, as an office table, as a conference table, as a table tennis, to play table tennis, a pool table. Yeah, let your imagination go wild. It's just in your imagination. You can create whatever you want. What materials it's going to be made of, its shape, its style, its color, all the materialistic aspects for its external creation. All right, so that's my internal creation. But with God's internal creation, it goes even a step further. Because when I am deciding to make this table, I'm already existing as a human being with a personality, a set of needs and desires, opinions and tastes. All of these already existing traits contributed to the idea of the table that I created in my mind. All right, depends on what type of person I am, what type of personality, that's going to depend what type of wood I'm going to use, what the purpose of the table is. But so, in other words, by the time I'm creating the table, even in my internal creation, it's already a creation. It's already halfway there. On the other hand, before God chose to create a world, there was nothing other than God. There was nothing outside of God. And there were no definable traits within God. Before God, in other words, God had to create the step before internal creation. When we're doing internal creation of the table, there's already things that are created that are contributing to the process of creation. Our feelings, our desires, our personalities, our character traits, those all already existed. By God, there's no feelings, there's no personalities, there's no character traits, because those are definitions which are limited definitions, which are creations. And God created all of those. And so when God came to create the world, God first had to create those definable traits within himself in order to now have an internal creation of the world, in order to create the physical world as we see it around us. So in other words, in order for God to desire a world, God first had to create divine desire. In order that God's world should have a reason and a purpose for its existence, God had to first create divine wisdom. In order for God to love his creations, God first had to create divine love. God had to create every single divine attribute. The same is with every other divine trait that described God's relationship with his creation. God first had to create that divine character trait. So according to the teachings of Kabbalah, the first step of God's creation process was the emanation of the 10 Sephirot. What are the 10 Sephirot? 10 divine attributes that God created, not as existences or realities outside of his own being, but as traits that he imparted to himself that would describe his relationship with his creation. And if you have a look on page 255, you'll see the map of these 10 divine attributes as described in the teachings of Kabbalah and Chasidism. These are the 10 attributes. Now, we're not going to go through these 10 attributes, perhaps another time, but this is the general idea of the 10 attributes. What do we gain with this idea? Now we can begin to understand the meaning of the Torah statement that the human being was created in the image of God. As the first link in the chain of creation, the 10 Sephiros are the source of everything. All desire in existence flows from the divine desire that God created in himself. And that's right there on the top. All wisdom is an offshoot of the divine wisdom. All love derives from the divine love implicit in the Sephira of Chesed. Sephira is the singular of the plural Sephirot or Sephiros, which is what I'm used to saying in Ashkenazic accent. Even physical creations like water, fire, earth, animals, they all derive from their spiritual prototypes in the higher links of the chain of creation. Just as the table that I build gets its form, its function, and other characteristics from the mental table I first created in my mind, so too everything physical comes from this spiritual creations of the 10 Sephiros, the 10 attributes. There is one creation that's different. There is one creation, however, that doesn't just derive from one of the 10 Sephiros, but rather it incorporates all 10. That creation is the human being. The human being incorporates all 10 Sephiros, has within it all 10 Sephiros. And this is how the Kabbalists explain the meaning of text 12, which we read earlier. The text discussing the creation of the human being, let us create a human being, let's create a human being, a person, in our image, after our likeness. Explains the Kabbalist. Let's look at text 13 on page 256. This verse contains a very deep idea which is sealed away in the treasure houses of the Kabbalists who seek out God. It holds the secret of the structure of the 10 Sephiros, which the human being incorporates in themselves, and for which the human form is an analog. God therefore says, in our image, meaning in the image we made for ourselves, God says, in the image I made for myself, these 10 Sephiros, I am going to create the human with those same 10 Sephiros, in that same map. And which is why, if we look at this map, what do we see here? It's an interesting form. This structure of the 10 Sephiros, what does it remind you of, generally? Somewhat. If it reminds you of the outline of a human form, then you're right. The Kabbalists go so far as to associate various Sephiros with corresponding organs and limbs of the human body. Chachma, right here, the mind, knowledge. Chachma is associated with, corresponds to the brain. Bina, the heart. Chesed, kindness, right here, the right arm. Vura, power, the left arm. And so on and so forth. It goes through each one, explaining this is the head, this is the heart, this is the right arm, the left arm, right leg, left leg, etc. And this also explains the us in the phrase, let us make a human. And the word in our image after our likeness. What's this referencing? So it says the Zohar, text 14, page 257. What's the plural? Our, us. Let us make a human being in our image after our likeness. Each sephira imparted its portion to the human being internally and externally. Had even one of the 10 sephiras not imparted its portion, the structure of the human being would have been incomplete. So earlier we said that idolatry is when we create God in our own image. The Torah concept, as explained by Kabbalah, is the exact opposite, that God created us in his image. And furthermore, this divine image, it is itself not the divine essence, it's a divine self-projection for the purpose of relating to us. Now that we have a general understanding of the structure of the 10 sephiros, the 10 divine attributes that God created within himself in order to relate to the creations, now the Kabbalists use this 10 sephiros model to explain how both sides of the great paradox are simultaneously true. Getting back to our original question. On the one hand, we said God remains completely free of all definitions and characteristics. And at the same time, we said we experience God's involvement in our lives in a variety of modalities, whether it's wisdom, love, justice, sovereignty, etc. How is it possible? So let's have a look at one of the great Kabbalists from Safad, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, known by his initials, the Ramah. Text 15. He gives a powerful and simple metaphor to understand this idea and how to explain the great paradox. And he says as follows, page 258. In truth, in regard to our Creator, the infinite Creator of all, we cannot speak or describe or require neither judgment nor compassion, neither anger nor wrath, neither variation nor limitation, nor any properties whatsoever, not before the emanation of the 10 sephiros, nor now after they were emanated. Right? God's essence has no attributes whatsoever. There's no way we can quantify or qualify God, which is the one hand of the paradox. But the Ramak explains further. What we should know, however, is that at the very beginning, God emanated 10 sephiros. And we can provide a nice analogy to make the matter understood by the mind of the wise thinker. And here goes the analogy. The analogy is of water that is distributed among various vessels. These vessels are of different colors. One is white, another is red, another is green, and so on with the rest of it. Now, when the water is channeled in these vessels, although the water itself is colorless, it will be seen in the colors of the respective vessels and appear to have changed to its vessel's color. In truth, however, the water did not acquire any new color. The variously colored vessels have imposed their colors on the water, but this imposition is only in relation to how the water appears to those who see it, not in relation to the water itself. The water never changes color. Explains the Ramak, so it is with these sephiras, with these attributes. The vessels in the analogy are the divine attributes that we call loving kindness, power, beauty, and so on. Each is colored in accordance with its function: white, red, green. The light of the emanator, which is the essence of the 10 divine energies that flow into the 10 sephiros, are like the colorless water as they transcend all variation and functions. The variation in their effect on the world is only due to the differences in function of their vessels. So how does this analogy explain the great paradox? The water in the colored vessels is and remains completely colorless. Yet to the outside observer, it seems that these waters have taken on a new color. Green water, red water, orange water. Why? Because they're perceiving the water via the colored vessels. So on the one hand, the water is colorless, but on the other hand, it's colored. In and of itself, it's colorless. In the experience of the observer, it's colored. The same is true, says the Ramak, of these 10 sephiros, these 10 attributes. In order to create and relate with our existence, God emanated from within his infinite, undefined being 10 attributes: wisdom, love, justice, etc. And God relates to us through these attributes. So we, the observer, we therefore experience God's presence in our lives in terms that are meaningful to us. God's wisdom, God's love, God's justice, and so on. But even as God relates and acts through these traits, God still remains completely undefined by them, just as the water in the analogy remains colorless, even as it's experienced as red or green by those who perceive it within the colored vessels they're inhabiting. That's how it's possible to have this great paradox, to reconcile the great paradox. Yes, on the one hand, it's colorless water, but on the other hand, it's perceived by the observer as orange water. So too over here, on the one hand, God is undefinable and remains undefinable. But while being undefinable to us, the observer, God is perceived as a loving God, as a God who's kind, and then the other attributes attributed to God. But what this means is, to a degree, and please excuse me as we go a few minutes over time, is that it's not real, right? It's a satisfying explanation, technically, intellectually, but emotionally, it's not satisfying whatsoever. Because in essence, what we're saying is that when we experience God's love, it's an illusion. When we experience God's anger, it's an illusion. Because it's the effect of a divine emanation which is operating through a colored vessel to create the effect of divine love, but it isn't really divine love because you can't define God. So God can't really have love or kindness or anything of the sort. And this is where Hasidic teaching comes in. Because Chassidus offers a secondary analogy which supplements this colored vessel analogy. And it gives the analogy of the parent playing with a child. Let's have a look in text 16, which gives us the actual analogy. All the worlds cannot apprehend God's greatness and power. God therefore performed many contractions to enable the worlds to relate with him. This is like a father who sees his child playing a game, and out of his love for his child, the father plays along with the child. Although for the father this is a childish and petty activity, nevertheless, out of his love for his child, and in order to derive pleasure from the child, the father contracts his adult mind and inserts himself in this childish mentality so that the child can relate to him. On the other hand, if the father were to conduct himself in accordance with his own mentality, the child would not be able to relate to the father, and the father would not derive pleasure from the child. What's happening in this game analogy? When a parent plays with a child, their adult persona contracts into a child self that they isolate from within the self. And then the parent becomes fully present within this child persona in order to fully relate with their child and derive pleasure from that interaction. And that's what creates this, on the one hand, a seemingly contrived interaction to a genuine engagement. Because the parent is truly there because they have fully inserted themselves into the child self that they have created within their own personality. And so we have the same paradox as the water, because here the water retains its colorlessness, even though to the outside viewer, it seems like it has taken upon itself water. And so in this color. And therefore, in the same way, the parent retains their adult personality, even as they are fully present within the child self that is engaging in a mutually pleasurable activity with their child. And this is what the Kabbalists refer to as the tzimtzum, the contraction. The greater reality, what is a tzimtzum? A tzimtzum is, a contraction is when a greater reality inserts itself into a smaller space. The greater reality does not reduce itself, but merely contracts, meaning that it's now fully present in all its being within that smaller space. And this is the model that Kabbalah and Chasidism provide for us to visualize the great paradox. God isolated from within his infinite being a 10-dimensional personality, the 10 spheres of wisdom, love, justice, compassion, etc. And this divine personality interfaces with our personality, which was created as its model and analog. So God remains undefined by these characteristics, but like the parent contracting themselves to engage with their child, God contracts himself, so to speak, within this divine image. This idea that we just explained, this great paradox, the 10 sephiros, the contraction, these ideas fill many, many volumes, tens, hundreds, thousands of volumes of Kabbalah and Hasidic teachings. And we can spend many hours, days, months, and even years discussing them. But now that we've introduced these ideas, let's go back to the Kabbalistic text at the beginning of this discussion and see if just a tiny bit of it is more meaningful to us. There are many more mysterious terms in the passage, but we can now recognize some of the Kabbalistic terms it employed, right? What did we say in the text? We said at the beginning of the manifestation of the king's will, the lamp of darkness engraved engravings in the supernal purity. What's the supernal purity? The undefinable essence of God, right? That's what we spoke about. There's the undefinable essence of God. It's not defined by anything. That's what it's talking about when it says supernal purity. And then we said that this lamp of darkness, which we'll get to in a minute, engraved engravings. What does it mean, engraved engravings? Engraved engravings means this idea of forming something outside of it. In other words, it forms of divine relationship from within the supernal reality, the supernal purity. And then what did we speak about? The lamp of darkness, because that's the paradox of the tzimtzum. On the one hand, it's a lamp because it enables revelation, but on the other hand, it's darkness because it's a concealment of the divine infinity. So it's the lamp of darkness, the concealment of the divine infinity is what enabled the engraved engravings within the supernal purity. And then we said that it was neither white, right, because it's colorless, using the analogy of the water, but on the other hand, they were painted because this is alluding to the colored vessel analogy. And so we see from here gives us a little bit of an understanding. Here's one Kabbalistic quote, which initially seemed like entire gibberish, and now it just seems like semi-gibberish, because we understand the possibility of gleaning some Kabbalistic ideas. Now, as we explained earlier, Chasidism doesn't just explain Kabbalah, but it also integrates it with all areas of Torah and applies it in relatable ways to our life. Where do we see this in this concept of the great paradox? So Chasidism explains that this great paradox is in our daily lives. What is the great paradox? On the one hand, to remain entirely aloof, the essence of God. On the other hand, simultaneously, to be involved with the world, right? That's what we explained in very generalistic terms, the idea of the great paradox. This great paradox is in our daily lives as well. We have that within our daily lives. On the one hand, we have a body. On the other hand, we have a soul. And these aspects, the body and the soul, are in constant conflict. Do we follow the body or do we follow the soul? And the reality is we have two options. One option is to pursue the material gains or ignoring the spiritual yearnings that we have from our soul. In other words, follow the body. On the other hand, we have the other possibility, which is ignore the material side of ourselves, our body, and lead an ascetic lifestyle, denying the body's physical drives. And indeed, in the years prior to revelation of the teachings of Chassidus, Jews chose one of these two. Came Chassidus and said that it's possible to embrace both sides of the paradox, just as God embraces both sides of the paradox. Because as we mentioned in the quote from Kabbalah that we quoted, the profound secret of endlessness insists that notwithstanding God's utter transcendence and absolute freedom from all definition, God is intimately present in every nook and cranny of his creation. So too taught the Baal Shem Tov in Chasidism, that the human soul can also fully embrace this paradox and be within the physical world. That although on the one hand, body and soul seemingly are opposing of each other, nonetheless, our spiritual and material drives can ultimately coexist and even complement one another. And this is the power of Torah, which shows us how to do that, how to take even the most mundane activities, mundane physical materialistic activities, eating, sleeping, earning a living, caring for our families, and transform them to show how they themselves are actual divine activities, ways of connecting with God and realizing our divine purpose. And this is what we said that Chassidus does. It takes an ordinary part of Torah, but shows us the meaning behind it. It shows us how seemingly something so simplistic and technical is really a message for our lives. And this, going back to lesson 2, where we discussed the legal meaning of the passage of the roadside assistance law, now we'll see how this law, this passage, actually teaches us how the coexistence of the body and soul is possible. In other words, how we can embody this great paradox and reconcile it in ourselves. What was just to quickly recap, what was the roadside assistance law? We said that when you see the enemy, the donkey of your enemy buckling under its weight, collapsing under its burden, and you are inclined to desist from assisting him, assist, you must assist with him. And we went through the details on this verse. Comes Chassidus, and Chassidus explains as follows. The Hebrew word chamor, that's the Hebrew word for donkey. That same Hebrew word also means material. Once we understand it in that light, we see it in an entirely different understanding of this verse. When you see the chamor, what does that mean? When you contemplate your material self, in other words, you truly see it, you contemplate it, and you'll see that it is antagonistic of the soul. It's your enemy. It seems to be your enemy. It's antagonistic to the soul, which yearns for godliness. But then you'll further see that the body regards Torah as a burden and it's collapsing under its burden. And you're inclined to desist from assisting him. What does that mean? You may be inclined to deprive your body, to break its materialistic nature because you want to follow your spiritual soul. This is not the Torah way. Rather, continues the verse, you must assist with him. Work with the body, elevate it, refine it, utilize it for your purpose of strengthening. Make sure you're healthy so you can pray better. Make sure you're healthy so you can support your family so they can pray better, so they can study Torah, so they can perform mitzvahs better. Work with materialism, not against it. This is one example of Hasidic teaching does time and again. It takes esoteric ideas of Kabbalah, this idea of the great paradox, which is perhaps the most esoteric idea of Kabbalah, and not just explains it in ways that can be understood for everyone, but also applies them in the most practical and meaningful way. With this, we conclude this course, the course of BookSmart. In the past 6 weeks, we explored all the various areas of Torah. And now, hopefully, when we open a Torah book, or when you open any Torah book, you'll have a general idea of what box, what genre this Torah idea stems from, what the difference between a Kabbalistic statement and a halachic ruling is. And yes, we've only scratched the surface, and we've gone through 3,300 years of study in a mere, was it 6 hours, or we went a little overtime. So instead of 9 hours, it's been about 10 hours, but nonetheless, it gives us a little insight. And where do we begin? Let's say we want to study Torah now. We want to study more Torah. What do we study? So the Torah tells us, and the Talmud tells us that a person should study the area of Torah that they connect with most, right? Just like a man who does, which has a saying go, someone who does something that they enjoy, someone whose livelihood, their work is something that they enjoy, they've never worked a day in their life, right? Because they enjoy it. So too, when it comes to Torah study, the Torah tells us that we should study areas of Torah that we connect with, that we love. So if you connect with Jewish halacha, with halachic works, Jewish law, then connect with that. If you connect with Midrash, then start with that, study that. And there are various areas that you can connect with. This is a shameless plug for a new book that just came out. I think it's a phenomenal book. It's called The Book of Jewish Knowledge. It's like a coffee table book. It's a big book. It's physically, it's a pretty big book. But it's a fascinating book that gives an overview of literally everything in Judaism. And the author of this book is actually the author of this curriculum, this course that we just studied. So it's a phenomenal book, special for the course. You get 10% off the book. I think it's also available on Amazon. I will send out an email about it if you'd like to purchase this book. It's definitely suggested.